Hello and welcome to Live at 525. My name is Debbie Ingram and I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Interfaith Action. Now, VIA is a federation of over 70 member and affiliated congregations across the state of many different faith traditions. And we work together using a community organizing methodology to try to affect systemic change around issues of social justice. And today our topic is community engagement with our police. So I hope that you will find this interesting and informative. And joining me today is one of our very active leaders in the organization, Bill Neal. Bill, you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, I am a retired clergy person, worked as a pastor first in the United Methodist Church and then for the last 15 or so in the United Church of Christ. And part of that ministry was in Vermont, most recently in Massachusetts before retiring. And now I am happily retired. What a new way to begin life. This is the beginning of my third year as a retired person.
Excellent. Yes, I was just saying, I'm very jealous of my retired friends, but that's great. Gives you a lot of time to do this important work.
It does, and this is part of the work that I wanted to do.
Great, awesome. Yeah, we're very happy to have you, and you've been very active in the organizing committee that has worked on reimagining public safety. So just to give folks a little context about that, here in Vermont, just this past November, we just passed the Prop 2, which is the amendment to abolish slavery from our state constitution without any exceptions. And we were very active, VIA was, in that campaign and trying to make sure that that got passed. And one of the reasons that we did that is because we have many of our members who are very interested in trying to dismantle systemic racism. And we were working on that even before we did the campaign to pass Prop 2. These folks that you've been working with and that I've been the organizer for, we discovered or we identified early on that one of the most egregious areas of systemic racism in our country, and that includes, unfortunately, in Vermont, is the area of public safety. So we've been trying to reimagine public safety. What would it look like if we really created law enforcement structures that made everyone feel safe, regardless of their skin color. And so, then we kind of took it from there. I'd be interested, Bill, if you would tell us about what struck you about, or what motivated you to take action about systemic racism and get involved specifically in the public safety area.
Mm-hmm. Well, it would be too long of a story to go into my whole history of concern about racism in our culture and country, but suffice it to say that growing up in the 60s, watching TV news, going to college and the diverse communities in the 70s, seminary with a bunch of kids from all sorts of different backgrounds, and then living in places like Detroit and Chicago and working outside of Cleveland and living in Akron. I've lived in a lot of the big cities of America, and I know the oppression of systemic racism and all the forms that it's taken. I particularly studied it with great interest in these last dozen or so years. In my last church in the Berkshires, I was able to work with a group called Multicultural Bridge, which was an African-American woman-operated concern that sought to educate communities and businesses and schools in the whole area of racism. And the crisis around policing and racism has become a national and international story of great importance, as we've seen so often over and over and over again. It hardly seemed like you couldn't go a week without some African-American kid being shot by somebody somewhere over something. So the need to address this issue and to do it with a strong, organized effort, including in a lovely, less diverse but equally important place as Vermont.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, I mean certainly for decades now if you're an aware person at all, you have become more attuned to the benefits of our society to white people, white people of privilege, and the terrible disadvantages that our structural mechanisms have for people of color. So, yeah, and I think a lot of people, a lot of your compatriots in our group became really galvanized by the whole George Floyd episode, right? And to the killing of George Floyd, and how horrible that was, how horrific it was to see that. And but what good has come out of that, at least, is that it has catalyzed a lot of people to actually take action. So Vermont Interfaith Action, that is our last name. So that's what we try to do. And you mentioned you've been involved in community organizing for a while. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how a community and organizing committee works, and how we go from talking about things and being concerned about issues to actually having an impact on them.
Right. Well, in faith-based community organizing, the issues bubble up from the bottom. They aren't imposed down by some group of experts sitting around in a room deciding what to tackle next. They come from conversations and involvements with local community people, and hearing and listening, and what are their concerns, what are the issues that they're living with and dealing with. And in those relationships and those conversations, then an issue comes to a point of being recognized as a viable issue that can be defined, that can be identified, that can go through a process of research and study, ultimately resulting in some kind of very concrete action, something that actually makes a difference, that moves the process forward. Martin Luther King's marvelous comment about the arc of justice is long, or the arc of history is long, but it leans towards justice. Well, we're trying to push that toward justice part. We want to bring the justice more real, more actual in people's day-to-day lives. So then coming up with a plan and putting that into action.
Great, terrific. Yeah, thank you. That's very, very good, succinct description of how we go about the work. So one important phase of our work is doing research, right? And that's something that we really take seriously at Vermont Interfaith Action, is doing our homework and actually knowing about the situation that we're commenting on and trying to impact, because we've probably all been to I don't know, a city council meeting or something, and heard people, sometimes people stand up and make comments about things that you can tell that they don't really know a whole lot about. So we don't want to be those people, and we want to be well informed. So so this public safety group, early on in our work, we started doing research with a lot of different people. Can you highlight some of that and what we learned? Right.
Yeah, I came back to Vermont in January 2 years ago in 2021, and this group was already organized and jumping and going forward. So I missed the first 2 or 3, gatherings and meetings. But the point was to look at the entire justice system, how it operates from policing all the way through the courts, all the way through the training of officers. So we reached out to quite a variety of folks, from the executive director of the Windham County NAACP, or the executive director of Vermont Racial Justice Alliance here in this area. There's a Vermont Racial Equity panel that has a UVM professor on it, who happens to be an expert in data mining and research. We talked to Vermont State Police officers at various levels, to town and city police chiefs, including Burlington, South Burlington, Winooski, and Williston. We actually got the chance to talk to Vermont's commissioner, the public safety commissioner, and some a defender general. So we've heard from, and the Vermont Criminal Justice Council, so, and state legislators. So we really tried to cover the whole gamut of who's involved in policing, and how cases are brought, and how folks even initially come to be arrested. So there's vast numbers of people in our conversations.
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, it's and it's really heartening actually in Vermont that it's easy. It's fairly easy to access these people, and they are very willing to speak to community groups. But yeah, a lot of work from people like yourself went into setting up those meetings and making sure that we could really find out, as you say, the whole broad scope of the system and how it works. or doesn't work, right, for some people. So what would you say are some of the the key takeaways that we got from that research?
Well, the Vermont Police Academy is the starting point for anybody that's going to become an officer, a sworn officer in any of the Vermont policing departments, from the state down to the most local or sheriff department. And so there's a common baseline of training that everybody goes through. That then is added to it. Various departments add additional trainings, requirements, and responses. So they are, every officer that's going to be sworn in gets a core level of important training information. They are then supposed to practice that, and putting it into practice on a daily basis is where we found the greatest concerns for our group. It's wonderful to have great programs, great principles, great practices, so-called best practices that are listed and called for. But then in the day-to-day operation, maybe it doesn't follow exactly, maybe somebody's emotions get the better of them, or the situation is deemed a little bit iffy. So looking at how that can be fully implemented, the trainings, the retrainings, the ongoing education, and then living it out in the day-to-day lives of each officer is where the rubber would meet the road. And we'd like to see that even further implemented, I think.
Yes, and I think related to that is that we discovered very frequently that there is a whole organizational culture that's set up, right, in a police force, and the people at the top are the ones who actually really set that, and are the ones that that really create the structures and the attitudes that that permeate how they interact with people out in the public. So that was very interesting to me. I think that we could all agree at VIA on sort of rejecting the notion that that you sometimes hear that it's just a matter of a few bad apples with police. Certainly. I don't want to imply that every police officer has some kind of problem, but what's wrong with that statement, I think, is that it doesn't completely understand that there's an organizational culture or a system that is set up that feeds into perpetuating certain ways of treating people, which is not really what we're looking for, right?
For sure.
Yeah. So then what, talk us through a little bit, how did we come up with ideas to actually impact what we learned about our different police departments?
Well, the great resource that we uncovered was the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. This was a nationwide initiative which listed several aspects of policing and community involvement or community engagement with the policing department and authorities. So in order to bring this closer to home where people live, we came up with a community engagement guide, a Vermont guide to community engagement with local policing departments, based on many of the conversations that we had, based on the groundwork of this policing task force for 21st century policing, which allowed us to come up with a set of steps that a small group in their local community could take to first form themselves as a group of folks that wanted to become engaged, become involved, find out what are the current practices of their local department, who are the leaders, how do they conduct themselves in the ongoing way of providing police coverage. And then looking at these outline of important standards and goals to be met, a set of questions that the local group could bring to the local authorities. Inquire of them, ask of them about trainings, about practices, about anti-bias, implicit awareness of bias, the actual stopping of vehicles for whatever reason, the kind of the details of how it is carried out. what are the trainings and how are they carried out. So we've got quite an extensive guide that has been established to use, and it's applicable to any individual's local community in a way that would hopefully be beneficial to bring forth the kind of community engagement that we're hoping for.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. I mean, I was very excited when we settled on this idea of, really trying to reach local people, and we discovered that there are already in some communities throughout Vermont these kind of ad hoc citizens groups, if you will, community groups where people have tried to find out more about racial equity data in their communities, and trying to understand what the processes are that their police department and maybe other mechanisms in their town government follow. So yeah, I was very excited when we seized on this idea of really encouraging those groups to come forth and then trying to come up with our own way of assisting them in having a dialogue with their local police departments. And yeah, our guide, we happen to have it here, right? It's just a short little guide. It's not onerous, but I think it is very thorough, though, actually. And we've gotten good feedback from people about how thorough it is, because as you were saying, it covers all these different topics and basically gives any kind of community group suggestions for questions that they can use in a dialogue with their police chiefs. We would recommend probably starting with the chief, but maybe talking to other police officers as well. And yeah, and then one of the interesting things I think too is that it's not just completely one-sided. It's not just focusing on the negative, right?
Right.
Yeah, you want to tell folks a little bit more about what else is included?
Not only are we concerned with the appropriate training and practices by the officers, but we're also wanting to acknowledge the challenges that the police are facing in their day-to-day work. It's not quite the same as being a correctional officer. It's a different category of work, although there are obviously some involvements there as well. But these are high-stress, difficult, demanding jobs. And so we want to acknowledge that, to recognize that, to look for the positive stories, to look for identify the challenges that they're facing, to help them explore their motivations for carrying out their work, and to highlight the good things that are being done. Someone once pointed out that the bad thing that happens is going to get a lot of coverage, but how many times does an officer in his or her daily duties help prevent some bad thing from happening? Mm-hmm. Those don't get headlines. Those don't get the big, attention grabbing. And there's a tremendous potential for the concept of protect and serve, when it can be lived out and practiced equitably, fairly, with a deep appreciation of the legal situation, but also granting dignity and respect to each and every person that they encounter. We had a wonderful conversation with the chief of Winooski, which is a city, but it's a very small city, and it's a very contained unit of population, and one of the most diverse communities, certainly in Vermont, and probably compared to a lot of other communities, very diverse. And I was impressed. I think all of us were, to see the way they were being a proactive force, making relationships, doing positive things, creating rewards for kids for doing the right thing with their bike or with their this or their that. So it's a challenge. I think the most difficult part for some of the policing entities is the idea that they would not only have an oversight group, but that oversight group would have some authority to speak to their issues. It's one thing to have a voice, but it's another thing to actually be able to influence what happens or didn't happen. And that's probably going to be, in some cases, a challenge to get over. Or the community has to accept the fact that the structure is what it is and work within it to the best that they can.
Yes, yeah, that's a good point, good point. Yeah, and this guide is not really about oversight so much as it is this interaction, this engagement, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and thank you for highlighting. I think I'm very proud that we included in that a lot of dialogue about positive things that the police do, or also acknowledging, as you pointed out, that it's a very tough job, and it's very stressful, and it's many officers go home to families, or and might have trouble dealing with their stress, and it affects not just them, but multiple people, and we need to acknowledge these are the men and women of our departments are human beings with their own personal lives, and we want to interact with them in a very relational way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. So let's see, what do we do next? So we came up with this guide, and then you want to share with folks how we first sort of kicked it off into the public?
Yeah. In a community organizing action, you have to have some kind of a public event, some way of getting a splash and getting the word out there. So last year, I think it was early April, we had a public releasing of and explanation of the guide. We held it at the College Street Congregational Church here in Burlington, provided plenty of press notice and public awareness, invited people to come in person or in Zoom fashion, so it was a hybrid gathering as well. Laid out the basic research that led up to the document, and then the actual document itself, and invited the folks that were there to identify themselves, what community were they from, in the hopes that we could gather some folks from the same communities who then would be the practicers, the ones that would try to put this into practice in their town or in their city, to see where it might lead. Unfortunately, we lost one of our earliest hoped for examples or models, so that process got a bit delayed, and we're still at the point where that would be our most desirable next step, would be to come across 3 or 4 persons in a particular community with whom we could work through the guide, and they in turn could go to their chief, to go to their select board, or whoever they need to speak with in order to carry on this dialogue, to begin this community engagement in their town. Once it's done anywhere, I think it would be a tremendous asset and a model and example for other communities to follow.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. That is kind of where we are at the moment, and for various and sundry reasons, it hasn't quite come together in any of the communities that we've approached yet, in terms of an ad hoc group actually using the guide to have a dialogue with their police department. But we've gotten a lot of good feedback, though, actually from people on the police commission here in Burlington, and from police chiefs that have read it. So we want to say to folks out there watching, if you are in a town and that can hear us, please contact VIA if you're interested in putting together a group and going and having good engagement with your police department, and discussing some of these topics with them to improve public safety in your community. So so we're working on that. I'm sure it will happen very soon. But that's one reason why we wanted to have the show today on this topic, because it's so important, and something we really need to address. And actually, I brought up the Burlington Police Commission. You actually got double duty, so you got to go and make a presentation. The commission was interested in hearing from us and learning more about this. You want to talk a little bit about their response?
Yes, the Burlington's Police Commission has been doing a really active job of meetings and carrying on conversation, developing their relationships with our acting chief and with the department. They represent a very diverse community of Burlington. They've done tremendous amounts of training at their level, at the commissioner level, brought in people to provide to them, so that they have much more familiarity now with these basic principles of policing. They the policing in Burlington is operated on a sort of a sub-district level. There are 5 policing districts within the larger city. So one of the thoughts that they had, that we suggested that they also thought would be relevant, would be possibly applying this model to us the smaller groups within their various districts, where they could have gatherings in a school cafeteria or an auditorium, or get people together closer to where they live and work, to see how these principles are being practiced in the Burlington area. Burlington Police Department has lost a lot of its employees over these last few years for one reason or another, and they are definitely at a place now of trying to rebuild, and they are trying to implement the 21st century policing guidelines. So my personal feeling is that they're doing the best they can with what they have to work with, which is challenging here as in many other places. Somebody pointed out that Burlington is kind of like Vermont's downtown. There might only be 40,000 people that live in Burlington, but a lot of people throughout Vermont or even across the state line come to Burlington for their entertainments, for their amusements and adventures, which means that the Burlington Police Department are dealing with a whole lot more than the population of Burlington, especially on a weekend night. And they have, in fact, reached out to the Vermont State Police for assistance in the downtown area. So it's a challenging time, a very challenging time, and the Police Commission here in Burlington deserves our highest praise and support for all that they are doing. And we would love to be an additional support in any way that we could be for their work.
Yes, yeah, and that is one of our goals also, is to kind of follow up with them and see how we might help them implement the use of this guide. But also what you were just saying, it reminds me that a part of the guide too that I don't think we highlighted enough is the idea that our police are often called upon to deal with folks who are suffering from mental health issues or crises or substance use disorders. And sometimes that can be very, particularly challenging. And I think we've seen all across the country that a lot of the situations that have led to, violent encounters have been have centered around dealing with folks with mental health issues and substance use disorders. And maybe the police are not always the best people to address those those concerns. And in Chittenden County there are, and I think in other parts of the state as well, there are outreach workers. We learned in our research about the fact that the Burlington police can call on someone to assist them with that. I know there are some other towns in the county that have that ability to call on outreach workers as well, that specialize more in those kinds of challenges.
Yeah, I forget the numbers, but there are several outreach workers now available to the policing department here in Burlington. And I think that's a great asset, and it's a very good move in the right direction to enhance that capacity, which sets the officers free then not to have to be a counselor or a therapist or to try to address somebody's issues that they're really is out of their ballpark. And for the size of its city, Burlington, I think is in a way leading the way towards that more healthy mental health approach to policing. In fact, I think they're having an easier time finding outreach workers than police officers at the moment.
Yeah, right, yes, yeah. Well, yeah, very, very important issues and important concerns. And again, I would just reiterate to anybody watching that we would be very happy for you to go on our website, which is www.viavt.org. I think it's been on your screen more than once here. And you take a look at our, if you go to the resources page, you'll see the guide itself. But if you're in a town where you would like, you and some of your neighbors would like to have a dialogue with your police department, this would be a great way for you to enter into that dialogue. So we're going to continue our good work and hope that we can help to bring about greater racial equity in the treatment of all persons that our public safety forces encounter. And thanks so much, Bill, for talking with me. And thanks to all of you for watching.